Si les parece, nos disponemos a continuar. Vamos a escuchar ahora a Ramesh Srinivasan, profesor en la Universidad de California de Los Ángeles, escritor y columnista, director de Cultura Global Digital. Su tema es política y economía internacional. Ramesh Srinivasan estudia la relación entre la tecnología, la política y las sociedades en todo el mundo. Ha sido miembro de la Facultad de Núclea desde el 2005 en los departamentos de estudio de información y diseño. Es el fundador del Laboratorio de Culturas Digitales UC-Wide, explorando el significado de la tecnología en todo el mundo mientras se extiende los confines de nuestro mundo. Es también autor de los libros de ¿Quién es la aldea global?, Repensar la forma en que la tecnología afecta a nuestro mundo, con NYU Press, y After the Internet, con Adam Fish, que será lanzado en diciembre del 2017. Srinivasan obtuvo su PhD en estudios de diseño en Harvard, su maestría en arte de los medios y ciencias en el Massachusetts Institute of Technology y su licenciatura en ingeniería industrial en Stanford. Ha servido a becas en el Laboratorio de Medios del MIT, en Cambridge y en el MIT Media Lab de Asia. También ha sido profesor en la Escuela de Graduados de Diseño y Departamento de Diseño Visual y Ambiental de Harvard. Srinivasan es orador regular de TEDx Talks y hace apariciones en los medios de comunicación, en MSNBC, NRP, Al Jazeera, Los Jóvenes Turcos, National Geographic y Public Radio International. Sus escritos han sido ampliamente publicados por Al Jazeera en inglés, CNN, Wired, el Washington Post, Forbes y The Huffington Post. Así que le damos un aplauso y nuestra bienvenida al doctor Srinivasan. Qué gusto verte. It's a pleasure. It's your turn now.
Hello, everybody. I promise to be very interesting and exciting because I'm keeping you from your lunch. So I will make this just as good as eating, and then you're going to eat afterward, okay? So I promise. I wanted to thank President Fox and his family for having me here. It's such an honor to have received an invitation from such a great leader as President Fox to attend this meeting and this conference. And I also wanted to let you know that you can interact with me, not during the talk, but right after the talk, through Twitter, via my handle, which is Ramesh Media. And I also want to say how special and wonderful it is for me to be here in Mexico. Mexico is really one of my favorite countries in the world. I got married here in Mexico, and it's a very, very special place because of many of the reasons that we've been speaking about the last 2 days. Okay? So, the story I want to tell you about today is a story about the internet and big data and what it means in our world in terms of the future of economics, of labor, of politics and democracy, and also of community and culture. So, remember Thomas Friedman's lecture from yesterday? He spoke about the cloud, and he said we talk about the cloud like it's fuzzy or warm or something we feel good about. But really what the cloud is, which is very much the basis of the internet as it functions, is actually controlled by just a few companies that happen to be from a very specific part of the world. And I'm speaking about Google and Facebook and Amazon and of course Apple in many ways. So this is so much the case that the global internet, including the internet that we experience here in Mexico right now, that over 80% of all of our digital traffic on the internet here in Mexico goes through one of these 4 servers. So what we actually have is a global internet where about 4 billion people or so in the world have access to the internet, and about 6 billion people have mobile phones. But that internet is actually being constructed and deployed and engineered and monetized for just a few companies that are located in a very specific and small region of the world. So while the internet may seem very global, and it is wonderful, it's accelerating and amplifying our lives in many ways, this global revolution is actually a very specific cultural set of voices, economic and political voices that are coming from where I'm from. I was literally born in Silicon Valley, and I went to Stanford and studied engineering, so I know this world. So what I want us to imagine in this lecture today is what we can do here in Mexico if actually Mexico became a center for information technology development. What if Mexico became the place where algorithms were developed that ended up having huge influence on Mexico and the world? What if Mexico became the place for social media? Why are we stuck in globally dependent relationships that are basically bowing to Silicon Valley? Now, I have many friends who work at Google and at Facebook. They may not be so happy that I'm saying this right now, but I want us to think truly democratically about the internet, because the internet is something that has such powerful promise in our lives. It means so much to so many of us. Okay. I wonder if you know what this image represents. This is actually the internet. The internet is not something that exists only in the clouds. It's not something simply that exists in these Silicon Valley companies that I mentioned. It is a specific set of fiber optic cables that run underneath the ocean surface that connect various parts of the world to other parts of the world. And specifically, the internet, like all other forms of infrastructure, follow existing political and economic relationships. There's a reason why, when I live in Los Angeles, it's so easy for me to fly to Mexico City, right? There's so many flights. Similarly, the cables of the internet connect the parts of the world that have more economic power and, in many cases, more financial power. And that's why you see so many cables here connecting the west coast of the United States to China, for example, to Shanghai and Beijing. But you also see so many cables connecting the east coast of the United States, specifically Wall Street, to centers of financial capital in Europe. But you don't see many cables. Now look at this diagram carefully. Take a picture of it and think about it later. You don't see many cables connecting the continents of the south. You don't see many cables, only 2 major cables that connect the infrastructures, that serve as the infrastructures to connect the continents of Africa and South America. So this kind of global equal internet, even on an infrastructural level, has not exactly come to be. And of course, I understand that that is natural, given the fact that we have to build systems in relation to places where people have money. But at the same time, I want us to think in a more humanistic way, in a more equal way, in a way that's more about the benefit and promise of the internet, to think about how it can truly empower people. And part of it might be an infrastructural question that I want us to think about. This is actually a map that shows access to the internet in different parts of the world. And again, not surprisingly, it is highly skewed toward urban centers where people have more access and more connectivity. And this is why, generally speaking, when you live in a rural location or in the campo here in Mexico, your connectivity is always much worse. And as I've been arguing in my writing recently, that's not just true with internet connectivity, but that's true even with access to mobile phones. And this is one of the major projects that's being led by Google and Facebook. This is an image of the Facebook project. It's a Facebook drone internet program. They're going to fly internet beaming airplanes to various parts of the world that don't have connectivity. And this sounds like a great thing, because then you can have access to the internet and you can do so many wonderful things with the internet. But actually, in many cases, this internet that Facebook is going to make accessible and available is not an internet that's open. It's not an internet where you can actually access the open world of digital information. It's an internet that's skewed toward the advertisers of Facebook. So this is a problem, because we speak in the United States about what's called net neutrality, right? The idea of everybody having an equal opportunity in relation to even having a website be visible or accessible. But that may not be the case if this ends up being the dynamic that takes over our world. So I want us to be aware of these issues and caution us to think about what we should advocate for here in Mexico. This is probably the most important slide I'm going to show in this whole talk. This is about the massive transformation of companies that serve as what we call platforms. They are digital web-based infrastructures that end up routing labor, commodities, and generally people's information. And this is so important because the biggest media company in the world is not Univision, it's not NBC Universal in the United States, it's not even CNN, it's Facebook. Facebook is the biggest media company in the world. And if you want evidence of that, look at the advertising revenues of Facebook, which is the equivalent of almost every other major media company put together in the United States. So this is an incredible transformation, because what does Facebook actually contribute? Well, it contributes a very incredible technology, much like Google, that helps us with search or social media. But also, in many cases, it doesn't actually create any content. We go to Facebook to see one another's posts, right? Yet, almost all of the money that's accumulated through that data, which can be sold in terms of personalized advertising, ends up making money, not for us who post on Facebook, and maybe that's okay, maybe that's not. It ends up making money for Facebook, right? And the story is very similar when it comes to Uber. Does Uber own any taxis? No. Does it actually hire the laborers that work for it? Yes, in a contract-based way, but not necessarily in a more permanent way that guarantees health benefits or a certain wage floor, or 6 months even of employment in some cases. So what we're having here is a huge crisis right now. I believe we're on the inflection points, the cusp of a major, major challenge that we're going to have to face and we're going to have to grapple with about what's going to happen with labor. Especially if and when, it's more like when, Uber and Google and other companies build robotic automated cars. There are about 4 million people in the United States who work in the trucking industry. What's going to happen to their jobs? Robots are going to take over. Robotic vehicles are going to take over those jobs. What about in Mexico with the campesinos, the people who are in the fields? Mexico is fundamentally, we talked about the exports of Mexico. Mexico is very much an agricultural nation. What happens when machines end up doing the agriculture instead of people? So I heard some great things in the conference the last couple days about labor, but I want us to be more specific, and I want to join you all in thinking about those issues. What is going to be the future of labor? Because we can't have technologies replace human activity and humans be obsolete. We can't have a few developers of algorithms and machines simply rule the world while we all just sort of sit around and watch and maybe not have any money or any income. That's not an okay option. So we need to think about those issues in very, very big ways. Thomas Friedman yesterday spoke about Airbnb and, the air mattress. Well, that's great. But then again, if most of the money is being made by the platform and the engineers and the investors in the platform, rather than necessarily other sorts of options or opportunities, it's going to destroy the hotel industry. So these are huge, huge issues that I feel like we need to grapple with. Let me just give you one very simple example of this. How many of you have Instagram? That's a lot of people. I don't, but I love Instagram, and I look at my wife's account on Instagram to look at the world. Now, Instagram is owned by Facebook. Facebook bought Instagram for about $1 billion, and at that time, Instagram had 13 employees. And now they say the valuation, so 13 kids, mainly 20 to 30-year-olds. I wish I was one of them. And they made over $1 billion, right? And now Instagram is probably valuated at least several times its earlier valuation. So it's made Facebook a great amount of money. And that's not bad in itself. They built an incredible platform. There are incredible photos on Instagram and so on. But what I want to remind you of is just within a couple months of when Instagram was purchased, the company Kodak in the United States went bankrupt. And Kodak had between 30 and 50,000 employees. So what happens when 50,000 people or 30,000 people lose their jobs and 13 people make $1 billion? That's a macroeconomic crisis that we really need to think about moving forward. Now, as we build AI systems that are going to circulate the world, like these machines, like these robots that are going to take our jobs from us, and I don't mean that in a scared way, I mean in many cases we need to just redefine and reimagine what labor should look like. And I think AT&T is doing a great job of this, which is what Tom Friedman was mentioning yesterday. But we also have to remember something that's very, very fundamental here, which is that the way you design an artificial intelligence system, trust me, I worked in AI for multiple years, always reflects the biases. And I don't mean that in a mean way. I just am biased based on who I am, right? So it's always going to reflect the biases of the designer of that algorithm. So the algorithm is an expression of meaning. It's an expression of what counts, how we extract the signal from the noise. And this is a real problem, because if an algorithm, for example, is designed to make faces look more beautiful, and it turns Barack Obama's face, who, by the way, is quite handsome no matter how he looks, I think most people would agree, into something more white. Look at these two images here. This was a mistake. It wasn't an intentionally racist issue, but the algorithm was learning based on a world that thinks that people with whiter skin are more beautiful than people with blacker skin. So it's actually reinforcing the biases, A, of the creator, who happened to be a Russian, white male-owned company, and a world that is already unequal. So the digital world is supposed to stop inequality and combat and support ethics. It's not supposed to reinforce and supposedly neutrally amplify inequality. So I want us to think hard, because I think we can take control over these issues right now. Now my favorite part. Okay. This is President Donald Trump in the United States. I don't think I need to introduce him too much more. This is he tends to not do many interviews with the press because he's been able to get away with attacking media institutions and journalistic institutions. In this interview with Fox News, which is a more right-leaning news source in the United States, Trump basically says directly, I don't need the media, I don't need the journalists. He uses the word fake media, because I can reach the people. I can reach 130 to 150 million people through how? Through Twitter. Now, there is some research that shows that about half of Donald Trump's Twitter followers are actually bots. They're actually fake accounts. So that makes this whole thing really, really interesting and funny. But there is something very telling and very disclosing about that perspective that Trump voices, which is that right now in the United States, and one might say in much of the world, there is a distrust of classical institutions, and we need to figure out why that came, this turn to right-wing populism that President Fox and others have spoken about. Where did this come from? How can we develop institutions that are more in line with people's values? But also, more generally, what is happening when people start distrusting the media that they view? Well, they go onto Facebook, they go onto Twitter. And I go onto Facebook because I don't think it's a problem to go on Facebook, because my friends are posting on Facebook, and I trust my friends, right? I would feel good about that. But actually, what happens if Facebook is invisibly shaping my experience so that I'm seeing content that skews my views politically, and it turns out that that's exactly what happened, not just with Russian-purchased advertisements on Facebook, which is a huge scandal now in the United States, but also with a group that was led on the board, a guy named Steve Bannon, who maybe you know about, who's a media strategist, a brilliant media strategist, is on the board of a company called Cambridge Analytica. So I spoke about this on national television in the United States on MSNBC, and Mika Brzezinski, who interviewed me, her jaw literally dropped in front of me. She said, and I said, yes, this is the new future. This is the new way in which we shape political and psychological sentiment, because what happened was Cambridge Analytica, a company run by a right-winger in the United States named Robert Mercer, actually influenced the posts that showed up on Facebook based on sponsored advertisements. But those advertisements don't look like normal advertisements. They look like news stories. And you think, oh, it's like my friend posting a news story. But the news stories are not general news stories. They were news stories that were optimized for not just who we are demographically, right? Like I'm a 40-year-old Indian guy from California who happens to be liberal. But they were optimized for our psychology, are psychometric sentiment, psychometric data analytic provided sentiment. So it's not just that he's a 40-year-old Indian guy, he's a 40-year-old neurotic Indian guy at certain times. So this actually, it turns out, influences voting behavior. So it may actually influence you in such a way where you say, hey, you know, I don't like that post because that influences me psychologically to not want to vote for Hillary Clinton. And this, it turns out, has been a huge influence on our political environment in the United States. And trust me, it's going to be an issue all over the world. And of course, the revelations have come out that this is part of what allowed fake news stories to be more visible in the United States than mainstream news stories. And part of that is because what Facebook optimizes its algorithm for is attention. The more attention you spend on something that you see, even click on it, especially click on it, or like it, or comment on it, the more data that they have of you. And the more data they have of you, the more money they can make. And therefore, the optimization of this supposedly social or journalistic space is actually optimized for corporate data ownership rather than any idea of a public discourse. So that's a bad problem. And this actually keeps coming out again and again and again. I spoke with Thomas Friedman yesterday about this problem just in relation to the massive murders in Las Vegas that just happened right when I came here to Guanajuato, to the state, to León. And it turns out that on Facebook, again, the news sources that were more visible, that were trending on Facebook, were actually lies. They were fake. They were being promoted by the right wing that were saying that the killer, they were first of all misidentifying the killer, and they were saying the killer was a Hillary Clinton supporter. So this is a huge problem, right? Because Facebook has accessed more for news in the United States than every other media network put together. And it's an invisible black box that seems, you know, it seems casual, it seems informal, it seems familiar, but it's actually full of misinformation based on algorithmic notions of relevance and prioritization. And this is the story. For $100,000, not a lot of money, the Russians were able to reach 10 million people in the United States through these psychometrically targeted advertisements. So this is a crisis in democratic polity and communication that we're facing right now. Okay, so that's the political side of it. I've spoken about the labor side of it. Now let me talk about the community side about it, and our world and cultural issues. And really my expertise is in all these areas, but I wrote a book recently that I published called Whose Global Village that I hope gets translated into Spanish that actually talks about these issues. So I was invited, this is a piece I wrote for Quartz, which is a sister publication of The Atlantic, where I explained how the algorithms that Silicon Valley designs culturally, not now politically or economically, reflect my biases rather than disrupt them. And the point I want to make here is I was actually invited by UNESCO to visit West Africa, the country of Cameroon. And I searched on Google, of course, for West Africa. And I thought Google would know me so well to know that, hey, this guy cares about actually people from that country. He wants to know what's really going on. But actually, all my top results were simply American-authored sites about Cameroon. Now, that's not inherently problematic, but it's problematic when that becomes the only way we experience information, because it turns out that 90% of people don't choose websites after the first page of Google, and 70% of people don't choose websites after the first 3 results on Google. So if I'm learning about another part of the world, imagine I'm learning about Mexico only from the perspective of Donald Trump, right? Wouldn't that be terrible? He doesn't even know it, right? Similarly, what if I'm only learning about Cameroon from the perspective of, you know, some American who may not know Cameroon from as much as someone in Cameroon, of course, right? So these are issues we have to deal with on a cultural and community-based level. So now it's time to think about what we can do about all of this. I've talked about problems. Sorry, I talked about that a lot. But we can do something about it. What we need to do is reimagine technology. We need to reimagine, first and foremost, that technologies are created by people within societies, within cultures. When I create a technology, it's an expression of who I am, right? I create and design something based on my way of viewing and thinking about the world. So similarly, we should think about how various cultures or communities or even nations, those of you who are entrepreneurs here, what does it look like to build a Mexican Facebook? Like, how would that compete with Facebook? Let's think about those questions. And one of the major arguments I want to make here is that we often talk about innovation as something that's only based in Silicon Valley. I literally went to the same high school as Steve Jobs, who's seen as the father of innovation, and he is highly innovative and brilliant. But innovation in that case came from almost infinite resources. But what happens when you have less resources, you have more constraints, and you think about innovation based on constraint? When you are in a situation where you don't have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of resources, how might you reimagine technology from that perspective? That's a huge question. And so here's one example that's right here in Mexico. I picked it out so I could share it with you here in Mexico. In the Oaxaca region, I'm working currently with a group of NGOs and communities that don't have cell phone service. These are Zapotec, Mixtec, and Mije communities. They have no cell phone coverage. But they want the cell phone coverage so they can use that economically and to speak to their families. Many Oaxacan people are in Los Angeles. You all know this more than I do. So what did they do? They built their own cell phone networks using open source software and hardware. They are now able to call one another for free. They can call one another long distance at 1/50th the price as before. And they can actually use these networks as a collective form of ownership. So all the money that's made by the systems they're building and designing is kept in the community. So this is a different kind of business model. It's a different kind of digital entrepreneurialism that I think we can think about. Let me give you another example. This example is extremely famous. This is the example of Mpesa. Also, some people describe a project that's similar to this that's called Centro. This is innovation, digital technological innovation that comes out of Kenya. It comes out of Nairobi in Kenya. That's amazing to think about what a digital world looks like when places like in Kenya become the place where that digital world is designed out of. And what's happening here? Well, there's not a very strong banking institutional system there. So people said, well, we have mobile phones. Why don't we just exchange mobile phone credits as a form of currency? And this has gone viral, but it started in Nairobi and now has spread to millions of people all over the east of Africa, simply trading credits on a mobile phone as a form of banking currency. And that's really interesting because then they built these local, this doesn't look like, Bancomer or Scotiabank or something, but this is a bank, right? This is an idea, again, of innovation within constraints. In this case, the constraint is the lack of access to financial institutions and financial capital, which then means people aren't going to get the money they need to start businesses. Instead, you can innovate in these types of ways. So this is digital currencies that are actually not the same as like a Bitcoin or an Ethereum, but it's actually a digital currency simply by trading mobile phone credits. Another example of innovation from constraint within a cultural context. You can basically do this, pay bills this way. And a third and final example I want to share before we conclude is an example from India. So I fairly recently, about 5-7 years ago, had the honor of briefly meeting Bill Gates. And Bill Gates addressed a conference with a bunch of academics like me, and we were all talking about these issues: digital divide, knowledge divide, how technology can empower economics, how technology can empower development. And I asked Bill Gates at the conference, I said, hey, do you think spreading more technology is going to solve these problems of inequality within Mexico or around the world? And Bill Gates said, absolutely not. If you just naively spread technologies that are authored by just a few companies, you make the companies richer. And of course, they can do cool or interesting things with the technology, but that's actually an afterthought from the overall economic and political transaction associated with the technology. So instead, how can we reimagine technology? So the Gates Foundation funded this project, which is really, really interesting, that is out of Bangalore in India, which is the IT hub of India, or one of the IT hubs of India. And this is a project called Digital Green. And basically it realizes that these farmers don't have access to mobile phone data per se, but they have phones. What happens if they use their phones simply to shoot videos and share videos with one another to actually smoothen out transactions so they can build their own local markets in their own local regions based upon the technology that they already have? Now, I know that the digital world is going to be more equal. We're going to have better access to technology. Some of these problems I've discussed are going to be resolved. But I want us to really think about the question of a global digital world that is basically only influenced by pretty young people for the most part, pretty young people from a very small part of the world in the United States. We can do better than that. We can think about technologies that start and support human labor, human visions of democracy, and the dignity of understanding and respecting other cultures. We can start and develop an internet that looks like that. So a lot of my writing is dedicated toward pushing that cause. And I think that's going to be a huge part of our future as we think about big data, algorithms, robotics, and so on. So this is some ways you can find me. You can email me. Please tweet with me, and I can, I would love to hear constructive criticism, your thoughts, your comments, and so on. But I'll be here much of the rest of the day. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was so interesting. Really, really good. Thank you. Qué sorpresa, ¿no? Reemplazó casi la comida como nos prometió Ramesh. ¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta para Ramesh? Si no, yo sí tengo, para variar. Sí, ¿quieres? Mientras te llega, le hago una yo. ¿Quieres? ¿Y le pueden alcanzar un micrófono a la señora o me la escribes? Por favor. Ramesh. What's the risk? And in what we are going to be transformed as human beings because of all this that you're talking. Here you can. Here you can, Ramesh.
Here? Okay. I'll speak here so we can speak to each other. So the question was it's a great question. What are the risks as we become transformed as human beings through all of this? Well, I think a lot of us already feel those forms of transformation. A lot of us, including me, like I'm not excluded from this issue, have issues with multitasking around technology. There's been some really interesting neuroscience and cognitive science studies that have shown how likes or getting likes on Facebook is a type of dopamine-influenced addiction. And we know dopamine is awesome, and it's great and it feels good, but we also know that in many cases it can leave us feeling empty afterward. We see that a lot with our children, who grow up as they call digital natives in many ways. So we have these issues. But I think the most troubling issue here of all, for me personally, again, coming personally out of Silicon Valley, is this belief system that I would say is almost spiritual, perhaps even religious, that believes that we should merge, our bodies should merge with machines. And if you don't believe me that this is real, this is not just science fiction, this is not just Terminator or Minority Report, which is another good film to describe where we're heading. This is actually being funded by Google, this type of work, where essentially there's the sort of idea of us fusing with technology, the singularity as Ray Kurzweil describes it, where essentially we will be merged with machines and therefore live forever, but it's very difficult to disambiguate what the human is from the machine in such a case. And the point I tried to make repeatedly is the machine is not a public machine, it's not a democratic machine, it's not a machine that we have any control over. These are proprietary corporate technologies that are going to serve not necessarily bad intentions, but often specific corporate private interests. And so that is not okay for my body to be taken over by a private corporation. That's just not okay for me. But we all should have the opportunity to make that choice. And some of us should be okay with that, and some of us won't. But the agency of the human being is being dismissed in this world that we're heading toward. I know it sounds scary. That's why I gave you those examples at the end.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ramesh.
Sure.
Claudia Basurto from Tijuana Innovadora. So my question is, do you get an example as this from the Mixtecos or Mijes or the Indian example that you give about women empowering women?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a really good question. So part of what, there are so many examples of technology and internet projects that have had very, very strong and good outcomes for not just the company, but also the community, right? And I want us to just think about those win-wins. And one of the best examples of that in the world, and it's not only about technology, are examples in microfinance and micro-lending. And the CITEK or Mpesa project that I showed earlier has actually worked really well with micro-lending. Mohammed Yunus, who's the former Nobel Peace Prize winner, was actually in our laboratory. I mean, it was such an honor. When I was a graduate student, I was just 22 years old. And those projects are mostly successful in my mind because they start with women. Because women are much more trustworthy when it comes to money. And I find that to be the same case in the project that I described from Oaxaca, which is called Teléfono Indígena Comunitaria. Yo hablo poco español. And that project is one where the asambleas that are deciding on the project are actually women's-led asambleas. The women are the ones with the money, and they're much more trustworthy. So we have to remember that any technical system that we develop should always work with human, cultural, and social systems.
Hi, my name is Geraldine Gonzalez, and just abounding on Claudia's question, that was going to be my original question, but I know that in the past, the World Bank and IMF have been designing, implementing, and executing some kind of funding for women in deprived areas. Are you trying to work with them, or have you been trying to work with them, along with them? Thank you.
So the question was, have I been working with World Bank and IMF-oriented groups that work with women's groups? I personally try to be agnostic. I want to work with anybody who shares these values. I did give a lecture at the World Bank about 5 years ago that went pretty well. I explained how certain economists whose work has influenced me, including 3 Nobel Prize winners, Elinor Ostrom, Amartya Sen, and Joseph Stiglitz, they all were very influential on me because they always talk about how economics always follows, first and foremost, cultural and philosophical issues. So it turns out that Amartya Sen makes the argument that in no truly democratic context has there ever been a famine before. Famines only exist when people don't have equal choice and equal opportunity. So these connections between the economic and the democratic are fundamental. So that's an indirect way of saying, absolutely, my door is open to anybody. I mean, it's very important for me that we are ethically on the same place, though. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Ramesh. Very nice meeting you. Thank you very much for all the information. My name is Nick Gonzalez, and I represent Artista of the Heart Foundation out of Los Angeles, California. And what we do, we go different countries in the world and look for the independent talent, but most the talent that has special needs, disabilities, because really nobody is paying attention to these kind of artists. They have a really huge talent, and I've been in 13 countries. Is there any, and my question is there any technology innovated that can help me and help the foundation to reach all these kids? And there's a lot of kids and people with disabilities that we're helping, we're awarding them throughout the world.
Yeah, so one thing, a lot of our challenge now in the United States, as we realized that we were misinformed, and even yesterday misinformed in Las Vegas about what the true story is to build technology literacy. So that's one thing we're trying to do. I really believe that has to be a fundamental part of our educational practice. I hope AT&T is doing that kind of work moving forward. But the work on disability is really important. There is a lot of research out there on trying to build good technologies to support people who might be blind or hearing impaired or disabled in other ways. And that actually, again, shouldn't be seen as like a problem. It should be seen as an opportunity for design and an opportunity for engineering. It's also a business opportunity as well. It's a win-win. That's my main point, is that we need to understand the world as it actually is when we build technology, rather than think the world should be a particular way from our cubicles when we're only around other engineers like me. My entire transformation came from traveling and being in the world. I've spent a lot of time in Mexico and realizing that the technologies I'm building are inappropriate for this part of the world because they don't actually understand the culture and literacy and infrastructures of other parts of the world. Mainly, I did work on these issues in India in the past.
Disability, talented, it's a big niche in the entertainment industry that nobody's paying attention to it. And I love what I'm doing.
We will.
Thank you very much.
No, my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anesh. It was great. Great.